All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors. Thank our TORAH sponsors for the month of Sivan. Steve and Teri Czinn for dedicating all the Shuman Joshos this month with gratitude to Hashem as they welcome their fifth grandchild, Gavriel Amichai Czinn. Excuse me, and loving memory of Dr. Zinn's mother, Doris Czinn, Devorah, Bas Rabbi Yisroel Yoel, Shaindy and Avraham Kelman, from Yisroel Yoel, commemoration of the yahrzeit of Avram's father, Rephael Yechiel, Ben Avram, Mr. Jerome W. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamos have an Aliyah and the families Einachama. Also with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Baruch Hashem, today's daf is Kuf Yud Aleph 111, and we are picking up at the Mishnah on Kuf Yud Amud Beis 110b. So if you remember again, we actually started the Mishnah yesterday, but let's just pick up from the beginning. Just keep our continuity. It says the Mishnah 110b on the bottom. Hamakabel Soda Mechaber L'Shavua Echad B'Sheva Meos Zuz Hashviyas Men Aminyan. If one goes ahead and leases a field from his friend for a Shavua, Shavua means a period of 7 years. Period of 7 years includes a Shemitah. Even though, again, in this case, the rental fee, right, or the lease fee, is 700 zuz. So one might have thought that, again, obviously it doesn't include the Shemitah year because Shemitah you can't work the field. Halacha l'maisa does include Shemitah. Okay. Kevla emenu sheva shanim. Conversely, if you go ahead and lease a field for 7 years, then in that case, again, b'sheva me'ozos for 700 zuz, ein hashviyas min aminyan. Shemitah is not counted as part of the lease duration. So the distinction between renting a field for a shavua, which by definition includes a Shemitah year, versus renting a field for 7 years, which does not include a Shemitah year. Okay, good. We saw that yesterday. Now, it comes to some very interesting halachas. So, now we're going to get into the sugya of paying your workers on time. So, schir yom gove kol halayla. If you have a hired worker who's hired to work by day. So the Torah tells us, we're going to go through this, the Torah gives a number of prohibitions and one positive commandment, ultimately to pay your worker on time. Pay your workers on time. The shayla is, what is the definition of on time? So the Mishnah says, well, it depends when the person is working. So for example, schir yom, if the person is hired to work by day, go v'kol halayla, oh bless you, ultimately again, you have to pay them sometime the following night. Sometime the following night, schir layla, if someone is hired to work at night, go v'kol hayom, then you have to pay them sometime the following day. So the idea over here is we're going to see this concept of schirus eina mishtalamis ela lebasof. When you have a hired worker, so the wage only accrues at the end of the employment. It's not like the wage accrues over the course of the employment. It accrues at the end of the employment, or I should say vests maybe at the end of the employment. As such, paying them on time means in the time frame immediately following the conclusion of the employment. So someone is a day laborer, you're obligated to pay them their wages by that night. Someone is a night laborer, you're obligated to pay them their wages by the following day. Fine. Schir shows, what happens, we'll say, if somebody's hired to work for a certain number of hours. Now Rashi points out over here that the definition of schir shows is someone who's, let's say, hired to work up until midday, part of a day or part of a night. So what's the halacha? So schir shows, go v'kol halayla v'kol hayom. So interestingly enough, for a schir shows, so you have the entire night and following day to be able to pay. Again, we'll see why that is. Schir Shabbos, schir chodesh, schir shana. What happens if someone is hired, right, for a week, right, for a month, or for a year, or schir shavua, yatsa bayom gove kol hayom, yatsa balayla gove kol halayla v'kol hayom. So as I say, interestingly enough, in these longer durations, and again, we'll explain this all in the Gemara, but in these longer durations of employment, everything depends when they finish working. So if they finish working by day, so let's say again, the long-term employment ends by day, you have to pay them the wage that day. Yatsa b'alayla, if they finish that night, then ultimately again, you have to pay them the wage sometime between the remainder of that night and the following day. Okay, good. We'll get into the mechanics of this, Emir Hashem. In the Gemara, says the Gemara, Tan Rabbanon, Minayin l'schir yom shegova kol halayla. How do you know, I will say, that when someone is hired to work by day, that you have to pay them the wage sometime that following night? So just to illustrate this, if I hire someone to work Tuesday during the day, they're my day laborer for Tuesday during the day, I have to pay them sometime Tuesday night before Wednesday morning. How do I know that? Talmud Lomar, lo salin pulas sachir itcha ad boker. Excuse me. The pasuk says that literally the wage of the worker shall not remain with you until morning, which means I have to pay my worker at night. So what type of worker do I have to pay at night? A worker that worked by day, that previous day, you have that entire night to be able to give them their wage. So again, somebody worked for me Tuesday during the day, right? I have to pay them sometime Tuesday night before Wednesday morning. And how do I know that if someone worked by night, you have to pay them sometime that following day? Pasuk says, on that day you shall give him his wage. So just to point out what's happening over here, the Torah has two different psukim, right? One pasuk says, do not allow the wage of your labor to remain with you throughout the night. Another pasuk says, pay your worker that day. So which one is it? Do I have to pay my worker that day or that night? The Gemara says it depends. If your worker is working by day, you have to pay him by the following night. If he's working by night, you have to pay him by the following day. Says the Gemara, but why do you interpret that way? Maybe it means something different. Maybe it means that if my worker works by day, when do I have to pay him? That day. And maybe if he works by night, when do I have to pay him? That night. So the Gemara says, here it is. The Gemara says, no, schirus. Shabbos says what I mentioned before. The concept of when you hire a worker, that worker only really goes ahead and earns his wage basof, at the end of the duration of the employment. Shabbos said, this is interesting. When you hire a day laborer, it's not the pshat that for every hour they work, they're accruing a wage. The wage vests, or the wage fully accrues, at the end of the duration of employment. So if I hire a day laborer, when the day is over, now I owe him money. So it makes sense, therefore, that I have to pay him at the following unit of time. So if he's working by day, I have to go ahead and pay him by that night. He's working by night, I have to pay him that day. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, it's about 4 lines up from the bottom. We learned this already in Ezun Neshach. Shabbos says this is very important. So the obligation ultimately, again, to pay a day laborer only vests at the end of that day. And therefore it makes sense to say that I have the following night to pay him. The opposite is true also. Somebody's working by night. The wage only vests or only accrues at the end of that night, which makes sense, therefore, to say that I have the following day to pay him. Okay, so we'll say that is our first unit of halacha. Tan Rabbanon. The fact that the pasuk says that the wage of the worker shall not remain with you, so I know that what that means is I have to pay him before morning. Why does the pasuk have to say until the morning? So Rabbi said, this is very interesting. If you delay paying the prohibition. So, for example, let's say I have a day laborer, right? So again, we just based on what we just learned. When do I have to pay him? Right? That night, sometime before the next morning. And if I don't pay him by the next morning, I'm in violation of this prohibition. Now, interestingly enough, the pasuk says it's repetitive. The pasuk says, "Lo salin pu'ulas sacher itcha ad boker." Do not allow the wage of the worker to remain with you until the morning. But the truth is that word morning is unnecessary. Once it says do not allow it to stay with me overnight, I understand I can't let it wait until morning. Why do you have to add in morning? So this is very interesting to teach me that I will say I only violate the biblical prohibition on that first morning. So let me illustrate this. I hire Reuven to work for me on Tuesday. So Tuesday during the day. So what's the halacha? When do I have to pay him by? Wednesday morning. Right? The latest by Wednesday morning. We'll say if Wednesday morning comes and I haven't paid him, I'm in violation of a biblical prohibition. Now, let's say I don't pay him for the next day also. So now it's Thursday morning. You might have thought that I incur another biblical prohibition. Kamash Malon, no I don't. Kamash Malon, right? Kamash Malon Torah teaches us the biblical prohibition is only incurred the first morning. After that, you don't incur biblical prohibitions for every subsequent morning that you fail to pay. So that's what it means ad boker. You only incur the Isser D'Oraisa the first morning you fail to pay. After that, you're not stacking up biblical prohibitions for failure to pay. So, but if I don't pay my worker, so right after that first morning, so is there no liability at all? Amarav over mishum baltasha. So Rav says you're in violation of baltasha. We'll say what's baltasha? Baltasha means an isser d'Rabbanan. Isser d'Rabbanan. So we'll say this is really quite a fascinating construct. So here's what we have. I hire a worker, so a day laborer has to be paid sometime by that following night before the next morning, right? I hire a worker for Tuesday during the day. I got to pay him sometime Tuesday night before Wednesday morning. I hire him Tuesday night, or I should say I hire him Tuesday night. He works through the night. I have to pay him sometime Wednesday during the day. If I fail to do so, right? If I fail to pay him in that unit of time, I'm in violation of biblical prohibition. But you only violate biblical prohibition once. So the first time you miss the proper window of payment, you are in violation of the biblical prohibition of failing to pay your workers on time. After that, it doesn't. So let's say I don't pay him for the next day, or the day after that, or the day after that. I don't accrue additional biblical prohibitions. Instead, after I pass the first window of non-payment, there's a rabbinic prohibition that we call baltasha, of delaying to pay your workers. Incredible. That's the halacha. Let's go back to Rabbi Yosef. Mikra, what's the pasuk? So we'll say, in other words, where does the rabbinic prohibition come from to fail to pay your workers? Al tomer l'reacha lech v'shuv u'machar etein v'yesh itcha. So the Gemara quotes the pasuk from Mishlei: don't tell your friend, come back tomorrow and I'll pay you, when you know that you have money now. So that's the rabbinic prohibition. That's the Isser D'Rabbanan. So it's a really fascinating construct. Fine, D'Rabbanan. Homer the Chaver Tzev V'Sachar Lipolim was a very interesting case here. Let's say I say to Ruvain's my friend, I say, Ruvain, go and hire workers for me. So I'm asking Ruvain to go out and hire workers on my behalf. What's the halacha? Shnehem einon ovrin mishum bal talin. Neither myself nor Ruvain, if we fail to pay the workers on time, are in violation of the biblical prohibition of delaying payment. Why not? This is very interesting. Zeh lefish lo sachran. So interestingly enough, I am not responsible. Why? I didn't hire the workers. So Rabbi says it's very interesting. The prohibition of baltalin, the prohibition of delaying paying your workers, is only a din if you hire the workers. In this case, I'm telling Ruvain to hire the workers. So now I tell Ruvain, hire workers for me for Tuesday. The workers work for me on Tuesday. I failed to pay them by Wednesday morning. So the Gemara says neither of us are in violation. I'm not in violation because I didn't actually hire them. I'm sorry? Oh, one second. Top of Kuf Yud Aleph. V'zeh lefi shein pe'ula. So etzlo. And Ruvain's not chayiv. Why isn't Ruvain chayiv? Because the workers aren't working for him. In other words, in order to be in violation of withholding wages, you really need two things. Number one, you have to have hired the workers. Number two, they have to be working for you. So in this case, interestingly enough, neither of us are in violation. I didn't hire the workers, even though, again, as Moshe is saying, Ruvain is my shaliach. But again, apparently, we'll talk about this. Why isn't shlichus an issue over here? Right? But Lamaisa, I didn't hire them, and Ruvain, they're not working for him. So technically speaking, neither of us would be in violation of delaying payment. One second. We'll say Kuf Yud from 111a, first line. Hey Chidami, what is the case? Now second line. Either Amar Lahu Scharchem Alai. If Ruvain hired the workers and Ruvain said, guys, even though I'm hiring you to work for Silber, but I'm responsible for your wages. If that's the case, right? If that's the either Amar Lahu Scharchem Alai Schara Alav. So we'll say if that's the case, then Ruvain is responsible for their wages, and if Ruvain is responsible for their wages, then failure to pay them on time should result in a biblical prohibition for him. Disanyo, how we learned this before, if I hire workers to work in my field, but I will say instead what I do is I put them to work in Ruvain's field, then what's the halacha? No sin lo schara mishalim. I'm obligated to pay them. The choser v'notal my balabayis mashahana also. And then I could go in and subsequently collect payments from Ruvain for the benefit that I visited upon Ruvain by bringing workers to his field. What do you see from here? You see from here that if you hire workers to work on someone else's field, but you take responsibility for their wages, you are the employer. So what's the case, right? So if Ruvain is hiring the workers from me, but he's telling the workers, guys, I'm guaranteeing your payment, then they work for Ruvain. If they work for Ruvain, now again, Ruvain may be able to capture the wages for me since they're working in my field, but Lamaisa, if Ruvain's hiring them and taking responsibility for their wages, they work for him. If they work for him, then failure to pay them on time results in Baal Talin for him. No. The case was says where Ruvain hires the workers. And what does he say to the workers? Silber is going to pay you. Silver is going to pay you. So I'll say, so this is the case where, again, technically speaking, if I fail to pay on time, neither of us are responsible for delaying of wages. I am not responsible because I didn't hire them, and Ruvain is not responsible because they're not working for him. So I'll say, it's just, I just want to point out, all I'm going to point out over here is a technicality. That you could, technically speaking, avert this prohibition in a technical way by, again, in this case where I ask Ruvain to hire workers for me. I didn't hire them, and therefore failure to pay them on time doesn't result in my biblical prohibition, and they technically don't work for Ruvain, because Ruvain hired them for me. Therefore, again, he's not in violation. Okay. Yehuda bar Merimar, Yehuda bar Merimar used to say to his servant, his attendant, Zil agerli poalim, go and hire workers for me, ve'emalohu scharchem al balabayis, and say to them, that me, or Yehuda bar Merimar, will pay their wages. And I will say, why would Yehuda bar Merimar do this? In order to avoid any type of biblical prohibition of Baal Talin. See, I will say, if you are an employer, the one thing that might get you a little bit nervous is what happens if you fail to pay on time, not because you're trying to Hashem cheat anyone. I don't know, you run out of town, or you're strapped for cash and you just need, a couple of more hours into the next time period in order to get it. So if you're an employer, you may want to set up these type of scenarios where if payment is delayed for some unexpected reason, you're not in violation of a biblical prohibition. That's what the Gemara is highlighting over. So Yehuda bar Merimar, when he would hire workers, would have his servant hire the workers. This way, should he be delayed in paying his workers for some reason, there would not be the biblical prohibition of Baal Talin. Okay, Merimar Umar Zutra Agri Lahadadi. Merimar Umar Zutra had this interesting practice. They would go ahead and hire workers for each other, right? So Merimar would hire Mar Zutra's workers and say to the workers, Mar Zutra will pay you. Mar Zutra would hire Merimar, and ultimately again said Merimar would pay you. By doing this, each avoided any potential position or any potential issue of Baal Talin, of delaying paying workers. Okay, we'll see another interesting exception over here. Amar Rava bar Afuna, Hani Shokai de Surah. These guys who work in the shuk, right? These guys who work in the shuk of Surah, work in the marketplace of Surah, Lo Avri Mishum Baal Talin. They are not in violation of Baal Talin, even though they delay paying their workers. Why? Neidi Yodi Da'al Yom Deshuka Smichi. Because the workers know, so apparently it used to happen is like this. In the people who worked in the shuk of Surah, so they understood they were doing work. So let's say for argument's sake, market day was Thursday, just for argument's sake, right? So the Balabatim would hire the workers to work on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but the workers understood that they were going to get paid from the proceeds of the sales. When would sales take place? On Thursday. So the Gemara just points out over here, this is not a case of Baal Talin. Why? Because since the workers understand from the beginning the nature of the setup over here, that often the Balabatim were not liquid, right? They didn't have money before the market day. Even though the work had to get done before the market day, there's no Baal Talin. Aval, Mishum Baal Tasha, Vadai Over. It is interesting, but again, because of Baal Tasha, what's Baal Tasha? Baal Tasha is the Isser D'Rabbanan. Right? The Isser D'Rabbanan you're certainly in violation of. So you see another interesting, so two carve-outs over here. So carve-out number one is, technically speaking, if you don't hire the workers, even though they're working for you and you're responsible for the wages, you're not in violation of Baal Talin. That's number one. Carve-out number two is, if the worker himself understands that the wages aren't going to come until later, right? If that's understood, then also there's no Baal Talin in that situation, but there would still be an Isser D'Rabbanan of Baal Tasha. Very interesting. Okay, let's go back there. Schir Shos Gava Kala Laila B'Chol Hayom. All right, so now we came to this interesting case of Schir Shos, right? Schir Shos. Schir Shos is someone who is hired to work for a limited amount of time. So opposed to a Schir Yom or a Schir Laila, where someone is hired for the entire day or the entire night, Schir Shos is someone who's hired for part of the day or part of the night. So the Mishnah said that a schir shos could collect, right? The employer could pay his wage the entire following night and the entire following day. Amarav, so we'll say that we're going to see this is a machlokes. Schir shos diyom govek kol hayom. So Rav says if you're hired to work for part of a day. Now here Rashi defines it as schir shos as ad chatzos. Rashi says schir shos diyom sheniskar lo min aboker ad chatzos. So just to illustrate this, so I hire a worker for half a day work. So Rav says if you hire a worker for half a day work, you have to pay him. We have to schir shos diyom govek kol hayom. First wide line on both sides. You have the entire day to pay him. So I hired someone to work from 7 o'clock in the morning till 12 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday. I have the rest of Tuesday day to pay him. Schir shos de laila govek kol laila. If you hire someone to work for a couple of hours at night, ultimately, again, he has the ability to go ahead. You have to pay him that following night. Look at Rashi. Schir shos de laila govek kol laila. Ch'lishiyala mudar shachar over mishum baltolin. So we'll say, so this is the position of Rav. When you hire someone to work part of the day or part of the night, so the halacha is you have to pay them sometime during the rest of that day or the rest of that night, depending when they're working. That's Rav. Shmuel says no. Schir shos diyom govek kol hayom. Shmuel agrees that if halacha l'maisa, I hired someone to work part of a day, you have to pay them for the rest of the day. U'schir shos de laila govek kol halayla v'chol hayom. So this is interesting. So Shmuel holds that if you hired someone to go ahead and work part of the night, you have the rest of the night as well as the remainder of the following day to be able to pay them. So an elongated, a longer window for what we'll call schir shos de laila. Okay, look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says over here, Shmuel Omer schir shos de yom hu govek kol hayom kedika amrat ve'in laila holich achar yom aval schir shos de laila govek kol halayla v'chol hayom shayom holich achar halayla. Now we'll say Shmuel's logic is like this. If I hire someone to work half a day on Tuesday, so I have to pay them the rest of sometime during the rest of the day Tuesday. If I hire someone to work Tuesday night, so let's say they work part of Tuesday night. So remember again, the way it works in halacha is the day follows the night. So therefore again, I hire someone to work Tuesday night. Technically speaking, Wednesday day is part of Tuesday night. So because of that, I have the remainder of Tuesday night and the entirety of Wednesday day to be able to pay them. That's Shmuel's logic. And that's still called paying someone the same day. So it's actually very intuitive. So Reuven works part of Tuesday day. Paying him on that day requires me to pay him Tuesday day. Reuven works Tuesday night, part of Tuesday night. I have all of the night and the entire following day, Wednesday, because that's all called Tuesday day to be able to pay him. Beautiful. So this is Machlokes Rav and Shmuel. So remember, they agree that if someone works part of a day, you have to pay them sometime during the rest of that day. If they work part of a night, Rav says you have to pay them sometime during the rest of that night. Shmuel says you have the night and that following day in order to be able to pay them. Of course, let's analyze this. So Tanan, schir shos govek kol hayom. Remember again, we learned in the Mishnah that if someone works for a couple of hours, you have to pay them. Right? If somebody worked for a couple of hours that night, or somebody, right, you could pay them the following night and the rest of the day. So the Gemara says, Tiyuv to the Rav. So this refutes the position of Rav. This seems to support Shmuel. That when someone works for a part of the night, you have the remainder of the night and the entire following day to be able to pay them. Or when the Charav, let's stud in Katanina, Rav says, no. You have to read that statement in two pieces. Schir shos de yom govek kol hayom. What the Mishnah means to say is like this. If someone worked for part of the day, you have to pay them during the rest of that day. Schir shos de laila. Someone worked for a couple of hours at night. So govek kol halayla. Ultimately, again, they have the ability to collect the rest of that night. Okay? So tonight, so we'll say, so therefore Rav could read the Mishnah in accordance with his understanding as well. So Tanan, Hayes Schir Shabbos, Schir Chodesh, Schir Shana, Schir Shavua. If a person worked for a week, for a month, for a year, for 7 years, right, a prolonged employment, so what's the halacha? Yotze bayom govek kol hayom. If they ended their employment by day, right, they end by day, so again, the employer has to pay them that day. Yotze balayla, if they go out and they finish the term of the employment that night, then what's the halacha? Govek kol halayla v'chol hayom. So they could collect that night, right? You have to pay them that night or sometime during the following day. So that would seem to support the position of Shmuel and refute Rav. Amar L'cha Rav, Tanahi. Rav says, no. The truth is, my machlokes with Shmuel is in fact the machlokes Tanoim. The Sanya, we learned Schir Shaos Diyom, if someone worked for a couple of hours by day, Gove Kol Hayom. You have to pay them sometime during the duration of the rest of the day. Schir Shaos Dalayla, if someone goes ahead and works for a couple of hours at night, Gove Kol Halayla. You have to pay them that night. Div Rabbi Yehuda. So we'll say Rabbi Yehuda. So Rav will say, I hold like Rabbi Yehuda. Right? That again, if you work part of a day, part of a night, you have to get paid sometime during the remainder of that day or night. Rabbi Shimon says, Schir Shaos Diyom Gove Kol Hayom. If you work for a couple of hours by day, you get paid that day. So Schir Shaos Dalayla Gove Kol Halayla V'Kol Hayom. If you work a couple of hours at night, the window of payment is the remainder of that night and the entire following day. What do you see from here? Mikan Amru, from here they said, Kalakovish Schar Sachir. If you go ahead and you withhold payment from your employee, over Behei Shemos Halalu Va'aseh. You are in violation of 5 prohibitions and 1 positive commandment. So as I say, now we're going to go through it. So Mishum Baal Tashok Esrayacha. So I will say, so ultimately, again, you're in violation of Baal. So again, so we're going to see these prohibitions pretty much all mean the same thing. The Torah just goes out of its way to frame 5 different prohibitions for holding back the wages of your employee. So number 1, Baal Tashok Esrayacha. Do not go Oshek. So we're going to see this term. Oshek means to steal, but it's a different kind of theft. Umishum bal tigzal, don't steal. Umishum bal tashok schar ani, don't schir ani, don't go ahead and hold back wages from a poor employee. Umishum bal tolin, don't keep the wages with you overnight. Umishum biyomo titein scharo, and because ultimately, again, give pay on the right day. Umishum lo savo alav hashemesh, do not allow the sun to set if you have not yet paid him. So the Gemara says, Hani dika biyimam aleka balayla, dika balayla aleka biyimam. So once I say, obviously, out of these 5 prohibitions, some of them only apply by day and not by night. Some of them only apply by night and not by day. Amar Rav Chisda, Hashem schirus ba'alma. When we say that if you don't pay your employee, you're in violation of 5 prohibitions, it throws a, at no point can you ever be in violation of all 5, right? Because again, some apply by day, payment by day, some apply by payment by night. But Lamaisa, what it does mean is that there are 5 prohibitions associated with non-payment of your employee. Fine. So also it says the Gemara, Ezu Oshak ve'ezu Gezel. So also I'll just point out over here, there is, okay, so it happens to be that we paskin, like Rav in this situation. That halacha l'maaseh will say that when somebody works for you, what we call a schir shaos, somebody works here for part of a day. So if he works a part of the day, you have to pay him that day. If he works a part of the night, you have to pay him that night. We do not paskin like Shmuel, that if you work for part of the night, you can pay that night and the rest of the day. So schir shows, part of a day, part of a night, you got to pay in that particular unit of time. The way we also paskin about say is, failure to pay, you incur the biblical prohibition when you pass the window. So for example, if somebody worked for me by day, I have to pay them ultimately sometime over the course of that night before sunrise the next day. Failure to do so is a biblical prohibition. But the biblical prohibition is only incurred once. Subsequently, after that, I incur an Isser D'Rabbanan. Okay, so fine, let's go back to Ezu, Oshek, Vezu, Gezel. So we'll say the Torah uses 2 different words. 2 different words for like withholding wages. It says Oshek and Gezel. So the Gemara says, what's Oshek and what's Gezel? Like, what are the differences between these terms? Amar Rav Chisda, Lech v'shuv zeh Oshek. So it's interesting what I'll say. So if I tell the worker, right, Reuven works for me Tuesday, right? He shows up to get paid. And I say, you know what? Do me, Reuven, come back later. And every time he shows up to get paid, I tell him to come back later. That's called Oshek. Oshek, Rabbi say, literally means like a withholding or a holding back. But if I say, Reuven, I have the money to pay you. I don't want to pay you now. I just don't feel like paying you. That's called gezel. That's called theft. Maskif Rav Sheshes, Ezu Oshek. What is Oshek? Shechayv alav Torah, carbon. So I'll say, what's the type of Oshek for which you are chayiv in the Torah? Carbon. I will say, remember, when do you incur carbonic liability? Carbonic liability is incurred when you owe something, you swear that you don't owe it. Right? Then it turns out that you're lying, then you're chayiv a carbon. So what's the case of Oshek that should be chayv a carbon for? Dumya dipikadon tika kafar le mamona. This would have to be a situation where you deny financial liability. Ela Amar Rav Sheshes says like this, a different interpretation. Nasativ lacha zehu Oshek. If I claim that I paid my worker, right, and in fact I didn't, that's called Oshek. So lying that I paid is called Oshek. Or, but if I say, listen, Ruvain, I know that I have to pay you, I even have the money to pay, but I'm not paying you, that's called Gezel. Maskif la Abaye says, Ezuhu Gezel, Shechayv alav Torah carbon. What's the type of theft? Where if you deny liability, you're going to be chayv a carbon. Dumya depikadon ba'ina dekakafar le mamona. It's a case where I deny a monetary obligation. El amar Abaye lo secharticha me'olam zeo oshek. So Abaye gives a different definition. What's oshek? Oshek ultimately is, I say, Ruvain, you never worked for me. I never hired you at all. That's oshek. Nasativ lacha, claiming that I paid Ruvain when I didn't pay him, zehu gezel. That's called theft. Ul Rav Sheshes maishna oshek tekashle maishna gezel kashle. According to Rav Sheshes, why did you have a kasha on the interpretation of oshek and not a kasha on the interpretation of gezel? Amar lacha gezel de gazle v'hadar kafre. Gezel has to be a case where ultimately, again, you stole and then denied that you stole. Ihachi, afilo oshek nami dehadar kafre. If that's the case, then oshek should also be a case of where you denied liability. Hachi ashta bishlam hasam ksiv o begezel mechlal de odile meikara. So what said, the lashon of the pasuk is o begezel. The lashon of o seems to indicate that halacha lamaisa I first admitted and then I denied the claim. Aval gabe oshek miksiv o ba'oshek o ashak kasav sha'ashko kvar. So we'll say, but o ashak, the pasuk seems to indicate that halacha lamaisa there was a denial or an act of theft from the beginning. Rava Amar zehu oshek zehu gezel. So we'll say, Rava says, by the way, there's no difference. Oshek and gezel are the same thing. Both refer to withholding wages. So why use two different words to highlight the same dynamic of withholding wages? Lavar Allah bishnei lavin. Ultimately, again, to make the employer in violation of two biblical prohibitions. So this is an interesting position of Rava. So as everyone beforehand was trying to highlight that there's a difference between Oshek and Gezel. They represent different types of withholding of wages. Rava comes along and says, same thing. Same thing. Why two different words for the same thing? To make you in violation of two different prohibitions. So I'll just point out something interesting. The Rambam himself in Hilchos Gzela has a different definition ultimately again of Oshek and Gezel. But the truth is he's not talking about withholding of wages. He's talking about actual theft. He says, for example, Ezu goes So interestingly enough, he says Gezel means forcibly taking something from someone. Versus Oshek, he says, Oshek means something came into your reshus, with the consent of the owner, and you refuse to give it back, right? So I borrowed something from someone, that's right, with the consent of the owner, and I refuse to give it back. That's called Oshek. Gezel is, I stole something from someone. But his definitions over here are by regular cases of theft. It appears that over here by the Gemara, by the halacha, ultimately, again, withholding wages, that we adopt the position of Rava, that really Oshek and Gezel are the same thing. They represent withholding wages. So why use two different terms for the same dynamic to make me in violation of two different biblical prohibitions? Incredible. All right, let's go back. I'll just mention over here, just kind of adarach hashkafa. Right? Our entire Gemara over here is focused on this sort of withholding wages. So, I was thinking about this. It's reminiscent of the Mishnah in Perkei Avos. What does the Mishnah say? Antigonus says, Al tu kavodim hamishamshin es harav amanas lekabel pras. Do not be like servants who serve the master for the sake of receiving reward. Rather, what does he say? Ella tu kavodim hamishamshin es harav shelo amanas lekabel pras. Be like servants who worship the master, not for the sake of receiving reward. I will say, now while this is a beautiful and lofty goal, if you think about it, it seems to be almost impossible, right? The ability to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu Lishma, right? Without any hope of reward, not hope of reward in this world, not hope of reward in the next world. I don't know, it seems to be almost like an impossible level to reach. Not only that, But the Torah Kedosha itself talks about reward, right? Parashas B'chul Kosai, we just had it not so long ago. In B'chul Kosai Teilechu Mitzasai Tishmorah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, if you keep my mitzvos, if you listen to my mitzvos, and the Torah itself goes through the reward that you're going to get. So what does it mean to be like servants? Don't serve Hashem for the sake of receiving reward. So what says, maybe it's like this. What's the chap over here? You see, in this world, in Olam Hazeh, when you work for someone, what's the halacha? Say, I work for someone, I go to work for Ruvain. What's Ruvain's obligation? What's his obligation? To pay me. And to pay me when? Immediately. Promptly. In other words, the way it works is, if you are an employee of someone, right? You are, quote unquote, a servant of someone, not a servant like in servitude, but just serve someone, the master is obligated to pay you and obligated to pay you instantly. Right? Quote unquote, instantly, within reason. Right? The day of, or the day after, the night after, or if it's a schir shos, the same amount of time. Maybe that's what Sumchas is saying. Sumchas is saying is, Atiu ka'avadim ha'mishamshin esarav amanas l'kaval pras. When you serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, say, is there reward for serving the Ribbon Shalom? Is there a reward? Is there a reward? Absolutely, unequivocally. Do you have to put that reward out of your mind? Absolutely not, because that would be virtually impossible. But how should you approach your service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Do not expect immediate gratification. Do not expect instantaneous payout like you are entitled to expect in this world. In this world, you work for someone, there is an expectation that I'm going to get paid immediately. Again, immediately is relative, right? Depending on the nature of your employment, as we've seen. Perhaps that's the pshat, that's what Sumchas is saying. When you serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, should you expect reward? Yes, in this world and in the next. But be spiritually and theologically mature enough to know that the reward doesn't come immediately. Unlike, we'll call it this world employment, where you have every right and expectation to go ahead and receive reward, to receive payment immediately and instantaneously. Antigonus says, don't take that approach to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The reward will come in this world and the next. When the Ribono Shel Olam runs a very complex system called the universe, and as such, you have to be patient. And perhaps that's what Antigonus says, not to not have in mind for reward, but to not apply the model of payment that we have in our physical or material employment setups to our theological relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Al tu kavodim hamishamshin esarav amanas l'kabel pras. Don't serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu like a human employee serves his master with the expectation of immediate payment. Rather, again, recognize payment will come. But the form of payment, the place of payment, the nature of the payment, that's up to the grand plan of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Incredible. Let's go weiter. Echad sachar adam ve'echad sachar beima ve'echad sachar kelim. So we'll say the Mishnah says as follows. Whether you go ahead and you hire a person, or you rent an animal, or you rent utensils. So we'll say a very important qualification on the Mishnah. The halacha is that the obligation or the prohibition of delaying wages doesn't just apply to a human being who works for you. Rather, it means payment for any service. So I go ahead and I rent Ruvain's animal, or I rent Ruvain's utensils. There's an obligation to pay for that service on time as well. And I will say, interestingly enough, in general, when do I violate the prohibition of lo salin? Bizman shetava, only after the employee has asked me for his wages. So we'll say this is interesting. In other words, technically speaking, the prohibition is not triggered if the employee does not ask for his wages. Once he's asked for his wages and I don't pay within the stated window, then haloch l'maisa, I am in violation. Lo tavo ein over halav. Technically speaking, if the employee never asks me for his wages, then haloch l'maisa, I am not in violation. Rashi says over here, lo savo ein over halav. B'gemar yolef le'dichsiv itcha midaitcha v'lo midaito. So I'll say this is very interesting. So technically, you see, one would have thought that the obligation to pay my employee on time is just an obligation that I have. So the Gemara is in Mishnah introducing me to the fact that I am not in violation of the biblical prohibition unless, of course, my employee asks me for payment. Right? He has to ask me, and then my failure to pay in the stated time makes me in violation of the biblical prohibition. Now, as you saw before, even if you're not in violation of the Isser D'Oraisa, you may still always be in violation of what? The Isser D'Rabbanan of Baal Tasha. Okay. So we'll say, now watch this. Let's say again, I hire Ruvain, and I say to Ruvain, okay, I'm going to pay you, but the way I worked out with Ruvain is I'm paying him in goods. So I have a store credit, right? I tell him, go to Target, right? I have a store credit, and buy whatever you need to buy. In other words, on credit, or shulchani, or the money changer, right? I have a credit with the money changer is going to pay you. Ain't over love. So we'll say in that case over here, let's say then the store fails to give him the goods, or the money changer fails to give him the money. I, the employer, am not in violation of Baal Talin. Since I did my job, and ultimately, again, I outsourced payment to someone else, failure of that third party to render payment does not make me in violation. Good. Sacher bismano nishma v'notal. We'll say, what happens if Ruvain works me for the day, and then what happens? Ruvain claims I didn't pay him. So I claimed I pay him. So I claimed that I paid him. So what's the halacha? The halacha is, as long as Ruvain is in the window of payment. So let's say, for example, he worked for me Tuesday by day. Or let's do it better. He worked for me Tuesday night. So the halacha is, he has the right to collect payment, or he's entitled to payment that entire following day. If he shows up in Beis Din during that time and claims that he did not get paid, he swears and he collects payment. Once the window closes, let's say again, Ruvain worked for me Tuesday by day, and he shows up in Beis Din on Thursday that he didn't get paid. So ultimately, again, he can't just take an oath and get paid. We'll discuss why this is. But if Ruvain claims that no, he came to me and asked for wages during the window in which I was supposed to pay him, and he has witnesses to that effect, then he could even swear later on and collect payment. Ger Toshav, Yesh bo mishum biyamo titein scharo, ve'en bo mishum lo solen pulas socher itcha ad boker. We'll say, what about a ger toshav? So this is interesting. Now we're transitioning to another discussion. What about non-Jews? I have a non-Jewish employee. So we'll say, so a ger toshav, remember again, a ger toshav, literally translated resident alien. He is a non-Jew. He is a non-Jew who observes Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach, the 7 Noachide laws. So the halacha is, failure to pay him on time makes me in violation of V'yomo Titein Scharo, pay your employee that day, but I'm not in violation of Lo Salin Pulas Sacher Itcha Ad Boker. Okay, why that is, we'll see in the Gemara. Let's go. So Mari Mas Nisin. So we'll say, who is the opinion reflected in our Mishnah? Lo Tanakama de Me'achicha, V'lo Rabbi Yisroel Yehuda. It's neither the Tanakama of the Drasha Me'achicha, which we haven't seen yet, neither is it Rabbi Yisroel Yehuda. Mayor, what are you talking about here? The Sanya. We'll say we learned in the Raisa. Amud Beis. Me'achicha, Prat Be'achirim. So we'll say, so the pasuk where the Gemara is referencing is Lo Sashok Schar Ani, Ve'evion Me'achecha O Me'gercha Sher Ba'artzecha B'sharecha. So literally again, do not withhold the wage of the ani. Ani is a poor person. Evion is even a poorer person, destitute person. Me'achecha, from your brethren. Ome gercha shebe'atzecha, from the stranger in your land who's in your gates. Okay, so now we'll say, here we go. So me'achecha, what does me'achecha come to teach me? Prat la'achirim. So we'll say this comes to exclude idolaters. Rashi says in Akum that achecha teaches you the only time that you're in violation of withholding wages is when it's for your brother. Now we'll say, brother may have a bit more of an extent. What's the definition of brother? Someone who's not an akum. Gercha, who's gercha? Ze ger tzedek. This refers to a convert. Bisharecha, ze ochal nevelos. This refers to a non-Jew who may eat non-kosher, but ultimately again has repudiated idolatry. So we'll say, so this is the Tanakama. Ainli ella sachar adam. So I only know that the prohibition of withholding wages applies to actual wages to an employee. I don't know that it even applies to, let's say, a rental fee that I have to pay either for the use of an animal or for utensils. That even if I owe a rental fee, I have to pay that rental fee on time. Therefore, the pasuk says in your land, kol sheba'artzecha, anything in your land. So in other words, any arrangement in your land, whether that is an employee or whether it's a rental fee, you're obligated to pay on time. The kulan ovrim b'chol hashemos halalu. So I will say, so whether it's that you owe a wage or that you owe a rental fee for an animal, for a utensil, failure to pay it on time makes you in violation of all of these prohibitions. Mikan amru, from here we learn, or from here we say, echad schar adam ve'echad schar behema ve'echad schar kelim Yesh bo mishum biyomo titein scharo. They'll say, so whether you owe someone money as an employee, or whether you owe a rental fee for a person, for an animal, or for a utensil, failure to pay on time, you are in violation of biyomo titein scharo. Pay your wages on time. V'yishbaen mishum ba'talin schula sachar. And other times, depending on who the person is, you will also be in violation of withholding the wages of a worker. Rabbi Yehuda says, Ger toshav yeshu mishum biyomo titein scharo, ve'ein bo mishum lo talin. So Rabbi Yehuda says that for a ger toshav, so remember again, we'll say, who's our ger toshav? A ger toshav is a non-Jew who lives in your midst, who has repudiated idolatry. So Rabbi Yehuda says that a ger toshav, you are in violation of biyomo titein scharo, but you're not in violation of lo salin. So we'll say what that means is, you can't withhold his wages, and if you do so, you are in violation of biblical prohibition, but not all the biblical prohibitions. Now, why you apply some and not others, we'll see in just a little bit. Behema v'kelim ein bahem ela mishum ba'al tashok bilvad. So behema and kelim, if you withhold rental amounts for animals or for utensils, so ultimately, again, you're only in a violation of ba'al tashok. Money. So we'll say, who is the opinion reflected in our Mishnah? If it's the Tanakama that we just quoted before, right? So we'll say, is the opinion who quoted the drasha of Me'achicha? Achecha, I should say, Me'achecha. If that's who it is, then Kashe Ger Toshav. Then we'll say, ultimately, again, we have the issue of Ger Toshav, because he excludes Ger Toshav. Rabbi Yossi, Kasha behema v'kelim. And if it's Rabbi Yossi, the problem is what do you do with the drasha of behema and kelim? All right, so we'll see. So we're just trying to figure out whose opinion is reflected in our Mishnah. Amar Rava, Hai Tana de Rabbi Shmuel. Rava says the truth is the Tana of our Mishnah is the Tana de Rabbi Shmuel. What does he say? Here we go. The Tana de Rabbi Shmuel, Echad schar adam ve'echad schar behema ve'echad schar kelim. So we'll say whether you owe wages to a person or whether you owe a rental amount for the use of an animal or for the use of utensils, Yesh bo mishum biyomo titein scharo mishum ba'al talin. You are in violation of both of these prohibitions, biyomo titein scharo and ba'al talin. Ger toshav yesh bo mishum biyomo titein scharo ve'ein bo mishum ba'al talin. We also say with the ger toshav, right? So if you owe a ger toshav money, you are in violation ultimately again of biyomo titein scharo, but not in violation of ba'al talin. So what does this mean? Now, my time the Tanakama de Me'achecha. What is the logic of the Tanakama of Me'achecha? Rabbi says, so that was the drasha that we made, right on the top of them. So remember again, what was that drasha? That drasha says Me'achecha. The first pasuk says your brother. That comes to exclude an akum. That comes to exclude idolaters. That if you withhold the wages of idolaters, ultimately again you are not in violation. Gercha, I'm just going over the drush again. Gercha included a ger tzedek, that a regular convert obligated can't hold back his wages. B'sha'arecha includes ultimately again a ger toshav. And ba'artzecha comes to exclude everything else. Rental of an animal, rental of utensils. So my time in Tanakam Me'achecha. So what's his logic? What's the logic of Tanakam Me'achecha? So here we go. Gomer, sechir. So we'll say he makes Gzer Shava of Sachir. Fine. So we'll say, and that allows him to go ahead and learn out from one context to the other. So we'll say, so again, we're just going through right now just like a lot of different drashas, and trying to figure out whose opinion is reflected in our Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda, lo gamer Sachir. So we'll say, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold of this Gzer Shava of Sachir. And he delos gamer Sachir, even though he does not learn out Sachir. Behema v'kelim mishum biyomo titein scharo nami nechayev. He should agree that withholding rental amounts for the use of an animal or utensils ultimately should be learned out from the pasuk of biyomo titein scharo. To which the Gemara says, Tani Rabbi Chananya Amar. So Tani Rabbi Chananya Amar. Rabbi Chananya says as follows: Amar Kra lo savo alav hashemesh ki anihu. So we'll say now this is actually very interesting. So the Gemara says as follows. The pasuk says, do not allow the sun to set ki anihu. Now we'll say we're switching gears for just a second over here. The pasuk that the Gemara is quoting over here is, listen to this, it's biyomo titein scharo v'lo savo ala hashemesh ki anihu. So we'll say now another pasuk. Now, same thing about withholding wages, but the pasuk literally reads, pay him on the day that he works. Pay him on the day that he works. Lo savo ala hashemesh. Do not allow the sun to set. So we'll say, so b'pashtos, this is talking about somebody who's either it could be a schir laila or it could be a schir shos, somebody who you have to pay by day, right? Do not allow the sun to set. Ki anihu, because he is poor. Ve'elav hu nose es nafsho, and literally again he puts his life in your hands. V'lo yikra alecha el Hashem b'yabachachet. Don't make him call out to God out of desperation. And if he does so, you will be accountable for this sin. Okay, so here we go. V'lo saval av Hashem ki anihu. So we'll say, so listen to this. Rabbi Chananya says as follows. The way the Torah phrases the prohibition or the obligation to pay your workers on time is it's talking about someone who's poor. So what do you see from here? Only someone who could come to a state of poverty is included in the prohibition of withholding wages. This would come to exclude rental amounts for an animal, rental amounts for utensil, where these items, the animal nor the utensils, can't come to being impoverished. So we'll say, what does the Tanakama do with this phrase, ki ani? The Rebbe is quite fascinating. So we'll say, Tanakama will say like this, ki ani will come to teach you a very important halacha. If I have two employees, one of them is wealthy, one of them is poor, there is an obligation to pay the poor employee before the wealthy employee. That's the halacha. Rabbi Yosef Yehuda. So where does Rabbi Yosef Yehuda learn this halacha? That you have to pay your poor employee before your rich employee. Milo sashok sachir ani ve'evyon nafka. He learns it out from don't hold back the wages, sachir ani ve'evyon. So we'll say, so again, the Torah goes out of its way to say, don't withhold the wages of the ani and the evyon. What does that tell you? Pay your poor workers, and again, pay your poor workers even before you pay your rich workers. I have a Tanakama. So why, according to Tanakama, I need two psukim. Tanakama, chad lahaktim ani la'ashir, v'chad lahaktim ani la'evyon. Okay, so we'll say, this is fascinating. Let's begin this today. This is fascinating. So we'll say, what we're now going to see is, not only is there an obligation to pay your workers on time, and we've seen that again, failure to pay your workers on time results in the violation of 5 prohibitions and 1 positive commandment, but in the world of workers as well, there's a hierarchy for how you pay those workers. There's a hierarchy. So if you have a rich worker and a poor worker, you have to pay your poor worker first. Now, I will say, in the world of poverty, there's also different gradations of poverty. Right? There's what's called an ani and an evyon. So an ani, ultimately, again, is someone who's poor. An evyon is someone who's even more poor. Right? Poorer. Evyon is even more destitute. So watch this. The Tanakama says, in the same way that you have to go ahead and pay the ani before the ashir, you have to pay the ani before the evyon. I will say, now I know at first glance that sounds counterintuitive. Why would you have to pay the ani before the evyon if the evyon is more destitute than the ani? And the answer is, Rashi points out over here that here's the concern. The evyon doesn't have any problem asking. The ani will have a problem asking. So because we are concerned that the ani will have a greater issue asking, therefore what? Therefore the halacha says, go pay him first. Go pay him first, right? The evyon has no problem asking. Essentially, the system advocates on behalf of the ani, telling the employer to pay him first. We need both of these. Why? Because if it would have just said evyon, it would have said evyon is not embarrassed to ask. Aval asher the kasef lemitve imalo. But an usher who is embarrassed to ask, maybe you should pay the usher before the ani. So therefore the Torah writes ani. The usher in an usher mishum delot sarich lei. And if we say usher, you pay the ani before the usher. Why? Because the usher doesn't need the money. Aval evyon did sarich lei imalo. But an evyon who does need it, maybe the evyon should be paid before the ani. Therefore again tzricha. So we'll say, so again, what comes out over here is an interesting hierarchy. So if you have, if you have a rich employee and a poor employee, you pay the poor employee first. The ani comes before the usher. But if you have 2 impoverished employees, right, one in ani and one in evyon, the halacha is you pay the ani before the evyon, even though the evyon is more impoverished. Why? Because the evyon will advocate on his own behalf, whereas the ani may be embarrassed. So we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up in Metzia Hashem, kind of leaving off like mid-sentence, But we'll pick up in Metzia Hashem with the Tana Didan in Metzia Hashem tomorrow. I will say, Shkoyach.